In 1998, an 82-year-old man in Osaka, Japan, walked out of a movie theater showing old war footage. His hands were shaking. He couldn't stop them. And that day, 55 years after March 3rd, 1943, Takashi Mieta finally told his grandson what he saw in the Bismarck Sea. Mieta-san sat at his kitchen table that evening, tea growing cold in his cup, and spoke words he'd kept buried for half a century. "I watched my captain die," he said quietly. "I watched good men drown. I watched a weapon I didn't understand destroy everything we thought we knew about naval warfare. And I survived when I shouldn't have. This is his story, and the story of thousands of young men, American, Australian, and Japanese, whose lives intersected in the waters between New Guinea and New Britain during 4 brutal days that changed the Pacific War. It's a story about innovation born from desperation, about tactical revolution, and about the human cost paid when the rules of warfare change faster than anyone can comprehend." 23-year-old seaman Takashi Mieta stands on the deck of the destroyer Shirayuki, watching 8 transport ships being loaded with supplies and soldiers. The harbor smells of fuel oil, salt water, and the cooking fires from the thousands of troops waiting to board. Around him, sailors joke nervously. Some have made this run to Leh before, and no American bombers will come. Others are making the journey for their first time. Mieta touches the photograph in his breast pocket. His mother and younger sister standing outside their home in Osaka. He'd promised to return when the war ended. Standing here, watching the organized chaos of a military convoy preparing for departure, that promise feels distant but real. The Imperial Japanese Navy controls these waters. The doctrine is clear. The tactics are proven. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, 26 years old, sits below deck on the transport Kembu Maru, writing what he believes is a routine letter to his wife, Yuki. The cargo hold is cramped, filled with 800 other soldiers from the 51st Division, but he's grown accustomed to discomfort. "We sail tomorrow for Leh," he writes by flashlight. "The journey is dangerous, but our Navy has made this crossing many times. I think of you constantly and dream of the day I return home." Around him, men check equipment, write similar letters, or try to sleep despite the oppressive heat and diesel fumes. These men aren't warriors seeking glory. They're sailors following orders, soldiers fulfilling duty, young men far from home, trying to survive a war they didn't start. What makes their story significant isn't heroism or sacrifice. It's that they became, unknowingly, test subjects for a tactical innovation that would render everything they'd trained for obsolete. Major Edward Larner, 29 commanding officer of the 91st Bombardment Squadron, sits in a briefing room looking at reconnaissance photographs of Rabaul Harbor. He sees the convoy assembling, 8 transports, multiple destroyer escorts, and feels the familiar weight of impossible mathematics. His squadron has tried everything to stop Japanese resupply convoys: high-altitude bombing that rarely hits anything, medium-altitude approaches that give ships time to maneuver, coordinated attacks that still result in most targets escaping. American forces on New Guinea need those Japanese reinforcements stopped. Ground commanders are desperate, but throwing more bombers at ships using conventional tactics just means more aircraft shot down, more crews lost for minimal results. Larner has attended too many memorial services for crews whose bombing runs accomplished nothing except getting them kills, which is why the modified B-25 sitting on the tarmac outside represents not hope exactly, but possibility, a chance that someone's crazy idea might actually work. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn, the man behind that crazy idea, isn't in Port Moresby today. The 43-year-old former Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces officer is back in Brisbane, already working on the next batch of modifications. But his obsessive 6-month project, turning B-25 medium bombers into something unprecedented, is about to be tested under the worst possible conditions, actual combat. Gunn's motivation wasn't glory or innovation for its own sake. It was frustration bordering on rage. Too many convoys getting through, too many American positions overrun by reinforced Japanese troops, too many conventional attacks failing. The modification he developed with engineer Jack Fox, removing the bombardier position and installing 8.50 caliber machine guns in the nose, seemed obvious in hindsight, but revolutionary in implementation. The 50 caliber M2 armor-piercing incendiary round fires a 619 grain projectile at 2,910 feet per second. 8 guns firing simultaneously release 6,800 rounds per minute, over 100 rounds every second. The math is simple. The implications are terrifying. But Larner, preparing his crews for the convoy intercept mission, doesn't think about implications. He thinks about the 19-year-old navigator who died last month when their B-17 was shot down during a failed high-altitude bombing run. He thinks about whether this new weapon will save lives or just kill people more efficiently. He thinks about going home to Iowa when the war ends and trying to explain what he did here. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stands on the bridge of his flagship, watching dawn break over a convoy formation that represents months of planning and significant resources. 8 destroyers protecting 8 transports carrying 6,900 soldiers, artillery, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment desperately needed at Leh. Kimura is 51 years old, a career naval officer who spent 3 decades studying tactics and doctrine. He knows American bombers will attempt to attack this convoy. They always do, but he also knows Japanese defenses have proven adequate for over a year. Ships in these waters have been attacked dozens of times, and most reach their destinations. The losses, while regrettable, remain within acceptable parameters for military operations. His confidence isn't arrogance. It's based on experience and proven methodology. Japanese anti-aircraft crews train constantly. Destroyer formations follow precise defensive patterns. Fighter cover from Rabaul provides additional protection. When American B-17s attack from high altitude, evasive maneuvers give ships time to turn away from falling bombs. When torpedo bombers attack, concentrated fire from multiple ships creates overlapping kill zones. The doctrine works. Captain Tamichihara, commanding the destroyer Shirayuki where Seaman Mieta serves, has made this run 4 times. Each time, American aircraft attacked. Each time, his ship survived through proper execution of defensive procedures. His gun crews are well trained. His officers are competent. His ship is maintained to high standards. Below deck on Kembu Maru, Lieutenant Yamamoto has finished his letter to Yuki and sealed the envelope, hoping to mail it when they reach Lai. He lies on his pack trying to rest, listening to the sounds of the ship, engines thrumming, water against the hull, the occasional footsteps on deck above. Around him, hundreds of other young men try to sleep or pass time in the cramped, uncomfortable quarters. Some are afraid, some are resigned, most are simply enduring, as soldiers throughout history have endured. No one on these ships understands they're about to encounter something that has never existed before. No one has trained for this. No one has developed countermeasures. Because until Major Gunn started welding machine guns into bomber noses in Australian workshops, this threat didn't exist. At 1000 hours, lookouts on the Japanese destroyers spot aircraft approaching from the south. Multiple contacts at medium altitude, what appears to be a standard American formation of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-25 Mitchells at around 7,000 feet. This is exactly what Japanese doctrine prepares for. Gun crews scramble to positions. Destroyers begin evasive maneuvers, not random turns, but precisely choreographed patterns designed to make targeting difficult. Anti-aircraft guns elevate toward the approaching bombers. Everything happens according to training and procedure. Seaman Mieta mans his 25mm cannon, scanning the sky through the gun sight. His hands work automatically, tracking, calculating deflection, preparing to fire. Around him, other gun positions do the same. The destroyer Shirayuki becomes a platform of concentrated firepower, every weapon pointed skyward. The high-altitude bombers begin their runs. Anti-aircraft fire opens up, creating patterns of smoke and tracers across the morning sky. It's dangerous, but familiar. This is what they've trained for. This is what has worked before, which is exactly what Major Larner and the Allied planners intended. While every Japanese eye watches the sky, while every gun points upward, 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and 12 B-25 Strafer bombers approach at wave-top height from the southwest. So low their propeller wash creates spray patterns on the ocean surface. Larner, leading the attack in his B-25 nicknamed Ruthless, flies 50 feet above the water at 280 miles per hour. He can see individual faces on the nearest destroyer's deck, can see sailors pointing at his aircraft in confusion, can see the 8 black holes in his bomber's nose where machine guns protrude. His hands are steady on the controls, but his heart races. In seconds, he'll either validate Pappy Gun's modification or die trying. There's no middle ground at this altitude, this speed, approaching ships with multiple anti-aircraft weapons that, if they turn to engage, will cut his aircraft apart. At 1,200 yards, less than 3/4 of a mile, Larner squeezes the trigger. The sound inside Ruthless is overwhelming. 8.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously create physical vibration that rattles Larner's teeth and blurs his vision. The tracers reach out toward the destroyer Shirayuki in converging streams. The effect on the target is immediate and catastrophic, not because war is exciting, but because steel and human tissue react predictably to high-velocity projectiles. Bridge windows shatter. Gun shields that protect against shrapnel fail against armor-piercing rounds. Men die, not heroically, not meaningfully. They simply stop existing as functional human beings. Captain Tamichihara, giving orders one moment, is killed the next. The helmsman dies at his post. Communications officers, navigators, lookouts, they have no time to react, no chance to take cover, no opportunity for the last thoughts or final words that popular culture assigns to death in combat. Seaman Mieta, still tracking high-altitude bombers with his 25mm cannon, hears a sound like industrial machinery, harsh, mechanical, wrong. He turns and watches his gun captain, standing 3 feet away, suddenly collapse with multiple wounds. Mieta's mind doesn't process what's happening. There's no frame of reference for this. Japanese naval doctrine has no response protocol for aircraft approaching at wave-top height with sustained automatic weapons fire. Something impacts Mieta's leg. He falls, looks down at blood pumping from where his knee used to be properly connected. The shock delays pain, a mercy that will end soon enough. Larner maintains his firing run for 8 seconds, an eternity in combat time, pouring over 900 rounds into Shirayuki's superstructure. The destroyer's anti-aircraft guns fall silent as crew members are killed or wounded. Then Larner releases 2 500-pound bombs that skip across the water and slam into the ship's hull below the waterline. The physics are straightforward. Bombs dropped at low altitude and high speed skip across water like stones. The delayed fuses allow penetration before detonation. The resulting explosions below the waterline open holes that flood compartments faster than damage control can respond. As Larner pulls up and away, Shirayuki lifts heavily to port. In the flooding engine room, men are trapped in rising water. Their screams carry through metal bulkheads, but accomplish nothing. No rescue is coming. They will drown in darkness, not because anyone is cruel, but because explosions below the waterline in naval vessels typically result in crew members drowning. Behind Larner, 11 more B-25 strafers select targets. What happens over the next 15 minutes isn't warfare as Admiral Kimura understands it. It's the collision of proven doctrine with unanticipated innovation, a collision that doctrine always loses. Lieutenant John Hennebree targets the transport Kyokusei Maru with his 8 nose guns. The sustained fire kills the bridge crew before they can react to the low-altitude threat. Captain Yoshida dies at his post, his last thought incomplete. His family in Yokohama will receive notification of death in service to the Emperor, but no details about industrial-scale killing that makes individual death essentially meaningless in the aggregate. Hennebree's skip bombs penetrate Kyokusei Maru's hull and detonate inside cargo holds, where Lieutenant Yamamoto and hundreds of other soldiers are packed into spaces designed for cargo, not people. The explosion creates overpressure that ruptures organs before flame and shrapnel arrive. Then cold water floods in. Yamamoto, still clutching the sealed letter to his wife, has perhaps 15 seconds of consciousness in the flooding hold. Just enough time to understand he's dying. Just enough time to feel terror. Not enough time for acceptance or peace or any of the narratives we construct about death to make it more bearable. Men in full combat gear have no chance in flooding compartments. The weight pulls them down. The darkness is absolute. The panic is overwhelming. Some drown quickly. Some take longer. None of it serves any purpose except ending lives in service of strategic objectives neither side can fully articulate. The Royal Australian Air Force bow fighters add their firepower, 20mm cannons, and .303 machine guns, focusing on anti-aircraft positions. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy watches through his gun sight as explosive rounds impact the transport Teo Maru's bridge and deck. He watches a sailor blown overboard by an explosion, watches lifeboats disintegrate, watches men fall. Cassidy will write later about what he saw, trying to find words adequate to describe organized destruction. He will struggle with this for the rest of his life, not with guilt exactly, but with the recognition that war reduces human beings to targets, and that he performed this reduction with professional efficiency. Commander Yasumi Doi aboard the destroyer Tokatsukaze watches his carefully trained gun crews being killed faster than they can respond to the low-altitude attack. These aren't just crew members. They're men whose families he knows, whose photographs he's seen, whose personal stories he's heard during long deployments. He tries to organize a defense, but Japanese naval doctrine has no chapter on defense against wave-top attackers with sustained automatic weapons. The training doesn't cover this. The manuals don't address this. The experience of senior officers doesn't include this. The destroyer Arashio attempts to position herself between attacking aircraft and the transports, a brave as an entirely futile gesture. 3 B-25s concentrate their combined firepower on the destroyer. 24 machine guns pouring 2,000 rounds per minute into the ship reduce it to a non-functional platform in seconds. Fire control systems fail. The rudder jams. Out of control, Arashio collides with the transport Nojima. On Nojima's deck, soldiers who survived skip bomb impacts now face fire and sinking simultaneously. Men jump into oil-slicked water. Some drown immediately under the weight of their equipment. Some swim briefly before exhaustion claims them. Some are strafed by B-25s making low passes, not from cruelty, but from tactical necessity. Every soldier who drowns today won't fight American ground forces tomorrow. The mathematics are brutal, but straightforward. Admiral Kimura, watching his convoy disintegrate, experiences something naval officers dread more than death: the complete invalidation of professional competence. He's been trained for 30 years in tactics that worked last year. Those tactics are now worthless, not because he executed them poorly, but because the fundamental assumptions underlying them, the capabilities and approach patterns of attacking aircraft, have changed in ways no one anticipated. There are no orders he can give that make sense in this context. Evade? The attackers are too fast. Concentrate fire? The gun crews are dead. Call for support? The radios are destroyed. For the first time in his career, Kimura understands what soldiers throughout history have learned in moments like this. Competence and training and experience mean nothing when someone changes the rules faster than you can adapt. The transport Oigawa Maru becomes the focus of multiple B-25s when her captain turns to present a broadside, a textbook defensive maneuver for conventional air attack that proves catastrophic against strafer gunships. Lieutenant Donald McCullers' 8 guns punch hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the ship's hull at the waterline. Secondary explosions from fuel and ammunition storage blow out sections of hull. In the holds, 1,500 embarked soldiers have no warning. Fire and explosive force and flying metal tear through packed humanity. The dying happens in darkness, in chaos, in moments too brief for comprehension. The ship breaks in half and sinks so quickly most soldiers never reach open air. Private Kenji Sato, 19 years old, finds himself underwater in absolute darkness with lungs burning. He claws in one direction, hits metal, claws another direction, hits metal. His mind, already overwhelmed by panic, cannot determine which way leads to air. His mouth opens involuntarily. Water rushes in. He drowns, swimming toward the bottom of the hold rather than the exit. He dies yards from safety he never knew existed. This is not heroic. This is not meaningful. This is a teenager drowning in darkness because military logistics required his transport to be in a specific location at a specific time, and American tactical innovation made that location fatal. The attack continues for 15 minutes total. In that brief window, 8 transports become burning wrecks, 4 destroyers sink, thousands of men die, some quickly, some slowly, none in ways that popular narratives about war would recognize as noble or purposeful. Japanese sailors in the water, assuming themselves safe from further attack, watch B-25s make strafing runs on lifeboats and swimmers. The pilots have explicit orders. Prevent reinforcements from reaching New Guinea by any means necessary. Every soldier who dies here is one fewer opponent for American ground forces to face later. This is brutal. This is calculating. This is what strategic warfare looks like when removed from narratives about honor and glory. It's mathematics written in human lives. By 10:15 hours, Admiral Kimura surveys devastation that has aged him visibly. His hands, steady this morning, now tremble. Of 8 transports, all are sinking or sunk. 4 destroyers are gone. The surviving destroyers carry dead and wounded, their superstructures riddled with holes that let in shafts of sunlight at impossible angles. The water is filled with debris and bodies. Of 6,900 troops who sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 will eventually reach Leh, most rescued by submarines arriving after dark. The majority of the 51st Division has been destroyed not in ground combat, where training and courage matter, but by a weapon no one anticipated in a form no one prepared for. Seaman Mieta, bleeding from his shattered leg, clings to wreckage and watches men drowning around him. He tries to swim toward a soldier flailing in the water, but his damaged leg won't function. He watches the soldier slip beneath the surface, one hand reaching upward even as water closes over him. That reaching hand will appear in Mieta's nightmares for 40 years. It will wake him from sleep. It will intrude into quiet moments. It will haunt him, not because he feels guilt for surviving, but because it represents the arbitrary nature of death in warfare. One man lives, another drowns, and there's no meaning in the distinction except randomness and circumstance. Mieta will be pulled from the water 8 hours later by a rescue destroyer. His leg will never properly heal. He will walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He will never speak about the war to his children or grandchildren until 1998, when old footage in a movie theater breaks something inside him that has been carefully controlled for 55 years. News of the convoy's complete destruction spreads through the Japanese fleet with immediate effect. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, receives the report and understands the implications instantly. Japan can no longer risk surface vessels in waters within range of American aircraft. The Navy's inability to protect even heavily escorted convoys means reinforcement and resupply of forward positions will become nearly impossible. This is strategically catastrophic for an island empire dependent on sea movement. Japanese garrisons throughout the Southwest Pacific will now slowly starve, running out of ammunition, medicine, food, reinforcements. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea doesn't just destroy one convoy, it effectively closes sea lanes to all future convoys, dooming thousands of Japanese soldiers to slow defeat on isolated islands. Yamamoto orders immediate review of convoy procedures and anti-aircraft defenses, but privately tells his staff, there may be no effective counter to these strafer bombers. They combine speed, firepower, and accuracy in ways we never anticipated. 2 months later, Yamamoto will die when American P-38 fighters, guided by signals intelligence, intercept his transport over Bougainville. But before his death, he writes in his journal about the Bismarck Sea. We lost more than ships and men that day. We lost freedom of movement. For an island empire, this loss is fatal. The B-25 strafer modification that proved so devastating began 6 months earlier with frustration rather than inspiration. Major Paul Pappy Gunn, watching conventional bombing attacks fail repeatedly against Japanese shipping, didn't have a breakthrough moment of genius. He had a persistent mechanical problem. How do you hit a moving ship? High-altitude bombing from 20,000 feet couldn't hit maneuvering vessels with any consistency. Torpedo attacks required specialized training and aircraft the Southwest Pacific didn't have in sufficient numbers. Medium-altitude bombing gave ships too much time to evade. Every approach had been tried. Every approach had failed more often than it succeeded. Gunn's solution was mechanically straightforward but doctrinally revolutionary. Remove the bombardier position from the B-25's nose and install as many .50 caliber machine guns as the structure could support. Turn the bomber into something that had never existed, a flying platform for sustained automatic weapons fire that could suppress anti-aircraft defenses while delivering skip bombs with unprecedented accuracy. Working with North American aviation representative Jack Fox in Australian workshops, Gunn spent 6 months experimenting with gun configurations, ammunition feed systems, structural reinforcements, and weight distribution. Each modification was trial and error. Weld gun mounts, test fire, adjust for vibration, and stress, repeat. Sometimes the weight distribution would be wrong and the aircraft would nose down in flight. Sometimes the ammunition feed would jam. Sometimes the structural stress would create dangerous metal fatigue. Sergeant Mike Torres, one of the mechanics helping with modifications, later said, we were improvising constantly. Pappy would ask, can we fit another gun here? And we'd measure, cut, weld, test. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes we had to start over. It wasn't elegant. It was crude mechanical problem solving under resource constraints. The final configuration mounted 8.50 caliber M2 machine guns in the nose. Each gun weighed 64 pounds and fired 850 rounds per minute. 8 guns firing together released 6,800 rounds per minute, over 100 rounds every second. The weight of fire was comparable to a light cruiser's secondary battery, but delivered from an aircraft approaching at 280 miles per hour at wave-top height. Paired with skip bombing techniques, developed independently by Major William Benn, dropping bombs at low altitude so they skip across water and penetrate below the waterline. The modification created a weapon system more effective against shipping than purpose-designed attack aircraft. This wasn't brilliant strategy or inspired tactics. This was mechanics with wrenches and welding torches solving a problem through iterative experimentation. The innovation came from desperation and resource constraints, not from planning or design bureaus. The crews flying Strafer-modified B-25s understood they were testing a new weapon system under conditions that could easily kill them. Approaching ships at 50 feet altitude at maximum speed meant any anti-aircraft fire that connected would be fatal. There was no room for evasion, no altitude for recovery if the aircraft was damaged. Success meant survival, failure meant death. Major Larner, leading the attack on March 3rd, carried that knowledge with him during the approach run. He wasn't thinking about tactical innovation or changing warfare. He was thinking about keeping his aircraft straight and level long enough to deliver effective fire, about timing the bomb release properly, about pulling up without hitting the ocean or getting shot down. After the attack, returning to Port Moresby, Larner sat in the debriefing and provided dry, factual assessment of what worked and what needed adjustment. He didn't discuss watching men die through his gun sight, didn't mention the sound of his 8 guns vibrating through the aircraft's frame, didn't describe what Japanese sailors looked like when armor-piercing incendiary rounds hit them. That night, alone in his quarters, he wrote a letter home to his wife in Iowa. The letter described the weather, asked about family, mentioned he was well. It said nothing about the day's mission, nothing about watching ships break apart, nothing about creating widows and orphans through professional execution of assigned duties. This silence wasn't because Larner lacked feelings or avoided responsibility. It was because there are no adequate words for describing what you feel when you kill people efficiently and professionally, knowing it was necessary, but understanding it was also terrible. The Australian Beaufighter crews experienced similar internal conflicts. Flight Sergeant Cassidy, who watched his 20mm cannon fire tear through the bridge of Teio Maru, wrote in his journal, "We did what needed doing. The Japanese would have done the same to us given the chance. But I watched men die today, and I can't pretend it felt like anything except ending human lives." This honesty about warfare's psychological cost wasn't weakness. It was recognition that killing people, even when tactically justified and strategically necessary, leaves marks on those who do it. For Japanese naval personnel who survived the Bismarck Sea convoy, the experience was profoundly disorienting. Everything they'd been trained to believe about naval defense, about anti-aircraft tactics, about convoy protection, about the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit, had been rendered irrelevant in 15 minutes. Captain Tamura, one of the few senior officers who survived, wrote in his official report, "The American bombers attacked in a manner we had never encountered or imagined. Their concentrated machine gun fire destroyed our defensive capabilities before we could respond. Our doctrine had no answer for this threat. The psychological impact extended beyond tactical surprise. Japanese naval personnel began to understand that technological innovation could overcome spirit and training. That American material resources and willingness to experiment created advantages no amount of dedication could counter. That the war they were fighting was changing in ways that made victory increasingly implausible. Seaman Mieta, recovering from his wounds in a hospital in Rabaul, watched other survivors arrive. He saw men with physical injuries, burns, shrapnel wounds, broken bones, but he also saw men with intact bodies who couldn't stop shaking, who woke screaming from nightmares, who stared at nothing for hours. The medical staff had no framework for treating psychological trauma from combat. Japanese military culture emphasized endurance and suppression of weakness. Soldiers and sailors were expected to absorb terrible experiences without complaint, to continue functioning regardless of internal state. So the survivors did what was expected. They returned to duty. They told no one about nightmares or anxiety or inability to forget the sound of comrades screaming as ships sank. They carried their trauma silently for decades because that's what their culture demanded. Mieta would carry his silence for 55 years, through the war's end, through occupation, through rebuilding, through marriage and children and grandchildren, until an old man in a movie theater saw footage that broke through carefully maintained walls and forced him to finally speak words kept buried for half a century. The success of B-25 strafers in the Bismarck Sea changed American tactical doctrine throughout the Southwest Pacific. By late 1943, strafer modifications became standard on B-25J production models, with North American aviation incorporating guns' field modifications directly into factory assembly. Strafer-equipped squadrons appeared wherever Japanese shipping operated, making daylight surface movement increasingly suicidal for Japanese forces. The impact on Japanese logistics proved catastrophic. Garrisons couldn't be adequately supplied, reinforcements couldn't reach forward positions, evacuation of troops from untenable locations became nearly impossible. The garrison at Leh, which the March 3rd convoy was meant to reinforce, never received adequate supplies and was evacuated in September 1943. The soldiers were forced to march through jungle and mountains with massive casualties from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. But the broader impact extended beyond tactical success. The B-25 strafer demonstrated that innovation, creativity, and willingness to challenge doctrine could produce revolutionary results. That sometimes the best solutions came not from design bureaus or planning staffs, but from field personnel with direct experience of operational problems. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, actively encouraged this kind of bottom-up innovation. He gave Pappy Gunn resources and authority to experiment. He listened to squadron commanders reporting what worked and what didn't. He adapted doctrine faster than Japanese forces could develop countermeasures. This approach, decentralized innovation driven by operational necessity rather than centralized planning, became characteristic of American military effectiveness throughout the war. Not because Americans were inherently more creative, but because American military culture more readily accepted deviation from established doctrine when field results demonstrated effectiveness. The B-25 Straffer's influence extended well beyond World War II. The concept of gunship aircraft, fixed-wing platforms, carrying heavy automatic weapons for sustained fire, evolved through the AC-47 Spooky in Vietnam to modern AC-130 gunships still in service today. The fundamental principle Pappy Gunn discovered remains valid. Aircraft approaching at low altitude with sustained automatic weapons can suppress ground defenses and deliver precise fire more effectively than high-altitude approaches. Every gunship developed since 1943 owes intellectual debt to modifications performed in Australian workshops with limited resources and unlimited determination. But beyond technical legacy, the B-25 Strafer story illustrates something fundamental about warfare. That advantage often comes not from superior resources or training, but from willingness to experiment, to fail, to try approaches that doctrine says shouldn't work. The Japanese Navy had superior ship handling training, excellent anti-aircraft gunnery, proven tactical doctrine. None of it mattered when someone changed the rules. American mechanics in workshops created a weapon that made all that training and doctrine irrelevant. In 1998, Takashi Mieta sat at his kitchen table in Osaka with his grandson and finally spoke about March 3rd, 1943. He described watching his captain die, described the sound of machine gun fire tearing through metal, described clinging to wreckage watching men drown, described the hand reaching up from the water as a soldier sank. "Why didn't you tell anyone before?" his grandson asked. Mieta was quiet for a long time. "Because I thought not speaking about it would make it less real," he finally said. "I thought if I didn't give it words, it would fade." But it never faded, not in 55 years. I still see it when I close my eyes. I still hear the sounds. I still feel the water and smell the burning oil. His grandson, who'd grown up knowing his grandfather was a veteran, but knowing nothing about his experiences, asked, "Do you blame the Americans?" Another long silence. "I blame war," Mieta said. "The Americans did what military necessity required. We would have done the same. But war takes young men and puts them in situations where they must kill or be killed, where innovation means death, where someone's clever idea with machine guns and welding torches means thousands of boys drown in darkness. I don't blame the Americans. I blame what war makes necessary." This perspective, understanding that individual participants in warfare operate within systems that constrain choices and define necessity, took Mieta decades to reach. In the immediate aftermath, in the years right after the war, he felt anger and confusion and trauma he had no framework to process. But time and reflection brought something more complex than anger. Recognition that the Americans who attacked his convoy were also young men following orders, doing jobs they'd been assigned, trying to survive in circumstances they didn't choose. That Major Larner pulling the trigger on 8.50 caliber machine guns wasn't evil or cruel, just effective at a job warfare required. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as a turning point in Pacific warfare, not because of the number of ships sunk or casualties inflicted, but because it demonstrated that innovation could render established doctrine obsolete overnight. That control of the sea now required control of the air above it. That American willingness to experiment and adapt and created advantages that Japanese adherence to proven doctrine couldn't counter. But the human cost of this tactical revolution gets lost in strategic analysis. thousands of young men, Japanese soldiers, Japanese sailors, American air crews, Australian pilots participated in those 4 days in March 1943. Some died, some survived, all were changed. Pappy Gunn's innovation was mechanically brilliant and tactically devastating. It shortened the Pacific War by making Japanese logistics impossible. It saved American lives by preventing reinforcements from reaching Japanese garrisons. By any strategic measure, it was successful. But success in warfare is measured in human costs that strategic analysis tends to minimize. Each transport sunk carried hundreds of young men who drowned in darkness. Each destroyer destroyed carried crew members who died at their posts. Each aircraft shot down carried air crews who never returned home. The innovation wasn't free. It was purchased with lives, mostly Japanese lives in this case, but lives nonetheless. Young men who had mothers and fathers and siblings and plans for after the war. Young men who died because tactical innovation made their positions untenable and their training inadequate. Admiral Kimura, standing on his bridge that March morning, was confident in his understanding of naval warfare. 4 hours later, his understanding was shattered, not because he was incompetent, but because someone changed the rules faster than he could adapt. That's what innovation does in warfare. It destroys certainty. It renders experience meaningless. It creates advantages for one side by making the other side's preparation irrelevant. The B-25 Straffer proved that in war, adaptation matters more than tradition. That sometimes the best answer comes from mechanics with wrenches rather than planners with doctrines. That resource constraints can drive innovation more effectively than unlimited budgets. But it also proved that the cost of innovation in warfare is always paid in human lives. By the innovator's enemies, certainly, but also by young men on both sides who die before anyone realizes the rules have changed. The waters of the Bismarck Sea still hold the remains of ships and men from March 1943. The wreckage lies in darkness, marking graves of thousands who sailed into history's judgment. Their story reminds us that warfare's evolution isn't progress. It's just change. Terrible, inevitable, human change that creates new ways to end human lives, while those lives remain equally precious, regardless of how efficiently we've learned to end them. Takashi Mieta died in 2004, 6 years after finally breaking his silence. His grandson, who listened to his story that evening in 1998, became a peace activist, working to preserve his grandfather's testimony as a reminder that warfare's costs extend far beyond strategic analysis and tactical innovation. The hand reaching up from the water, the image that haunted Mieta for 55 years, appears in his grandson's presentations about the war, not to glorify or condemn, but to remember. To insist that behind every strategic decision, every tactical innovation, every successful mission are human beings whose lives matter equally, regardless of what uniform they wore or what side they fought for. That's the lesson of the Bismarck Sea. Innovation changes warfare's methods, but not its cost. The B-25 Straffer was revolutionary, but the young men who drowned when it proved its effectiveness died just as certainly, just as terribly, as soldiers throughout history. Their deaths served strategic purposes, but those purposes didn't make the deaths less tragic or the innovation less expensive in human terms. At 0312 hours on June 7th, 1944, radio man Calvin Bull heard something that made his blood turn to ice. The distinct mechanical whine of destroyer propellers cutting through black water, closing fast at 28 knots, hunting for the submarine that had just killed one of their own 6 hours earlier. Commander Samuel David Dealey stood motionless in Harder's cramped conning tower, his hand resting on the cold steel of the periscope well. Outside, in the moonless dark of the Sibatu Passage, the Japanese destroyer Hayanami was closing the distance, her sonar pinging through the deep like a predator's heartbeat. Every man aboard USS Harder knew what happened when destroyers found you. Between December 1941 and March 1944, they'd sent 14 American submarines to the bottom. Not one American submarine had ever sunk a Japanese destroyer in direct combat while both vessels were actively engaged. Until yesterday, when Dealey changed everything. Samuel David Dealey wasn't supposed to be the man who revolutionized submarine warfare. Born in Dallas, Texas, on September 13th, 1906, he graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1930, a quiet officer whose lucky bag yearbook entry noted that, the greater the stress, the more he smiled. After service aboard Battleship Nevada and Destroyer Rathburn, he entered submarine school in New London in 1934. By December 1942, at age 36, he took command of USS Harder, a brand new Gatto-class submarine that displaced 1,549 tons, surfaced, stretched 311 feet long, and could make 21 knots on the surface while barely managing 9 submerged. The numbers told a stark story. A destroyer could hit 35 knots, nearly 4 times faster than a submerged submarine. They carried dozens of depth charges designed to crush a submarine's hull like a tin can. Their sonar could detect a submarine from miles away. The tactical doctrine was simple. If a destroyer detected you, you ran deep, rigged for silent running, and prayed the depth charges missed. Dealey had different ideas. Harder's first 3 war patrols, from June to November 1943, off the coast of Japan, were textbook submarine operations, stalking convoys, dodging escorts, fighting temperamental torpedoes that either detonated prematurely or ran under targets without exploding. On the very first attack on June 22, 1943, a torpedo exploded just 15 seconds into its run, giving away Harder's position. In the desperate dive that followed, Harder slammed into the muddy bottom, jamming herself in the muck with 12 depth charges detonating overhead. It took 4 hours of agonizing work to break free, the crew working in near darkness, knowing that any moment could bring another salvo that would crack their hull open to the crushing Pacific. But Dealey learned from every encounter. He studied destroyer captain psychology, their patterns, their predictable zigzagging, the split-second hesitation when a submarine did something unexpected. By his 4th war patrol in March 1944, he was ready to test a theory that every other submarine commander considered suicidal. April 13th, 1944. Harder was operating 200 nautical miles south of Guam when a Japanese reconnaissance plane spotted her periscope wake and radioed the position to destroyer Ikazuchi. Ikazuchi was a veteran. Earlier in the war, She'd rescued over 400 survivors from the sunken British cruiser HMS Exeter and destroyer HMS Encounter after the Battle of the Java Sea. Her captain was experienced, confident, deadly. He ordered flank speed and turned his bow directly toward Harder's position, preparing to drop depth charges the moment the submarine dove. Every officer in Harder's conning tower expected Dealey to dive deep and run. Standard doctrine, proven tactic, the only sensible choice when a destroyer had you in its sights. Dealey didn't dive. Instead, he ordered flank speed ahead, straight at the destroyer. The conning tower went silent. Men glanced at each other, wondering if their captain had finally cracked under the pressure of 4 consecutive war patrols. Outside, Ikazuchi's bow wave grew larger in the periscope lens, churning white water, closing the range at combined speeds, approaching 50 miles per hour. 900 yards. Dealey's voice was calm, almost conversational. Fire 1, 800 yards. Fire 2, 700 yards. The destroyer's bow filled the entire periscope view. Fire 3. Fire 4. Take her down. 300 feet. Emergency dive. Harder's bow dropped at a 30-degree angle as compressed air roared out of the ballast tanks. The deck tilted sharply. Men grabbed handholds. The diving planes bit hard, pushing the submarine down into the dark embrace of the Pacific. Seconds ticked by like hours. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then 2 massive explosions shook Harder so violently that light fixtures shattered and rained glass across the control room. The submarine bucked, her stern lifting 6 feet before slamming back down. More explosions followed, Ikazuchi's own depth charges detonating as the destroyer broke in half and plunged toward the bottom, killing all but a handful of her crew. When Dealey risked a look through the periscope moments later, he saw only an expanding oil slick and debris field where a 2,000-ton destroyer had been churning toward them. He sent a radio report that became legendary throughout the Pacific Submarine Force. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 Jap destroyer. The tactic had a name now, the down-the-throat shot. Fire torpedoes straight at an attacking destroyer's bow, then dive beneath her keel before she could drop depth charges directly on your position. If your torpedoes missed, the destroyer would be right on top of you, and you'd die. If you dove too late, the destroyer would ram you, and you'd die. If you dove too early, the destroyer captain would see the dive, adjust his course, and drop depth charges exactly where you were heading. The margin for error was measured in seconds. But Dealey had understood something crucial. Destroyer captains expected submarines to run. When a submarine charged instead, it created a moment of cognitive dissonance, a split-second hesitation while the destroyer captain's brain tried to reconcile what his eyes were seeing with what his training told him should be happening. In that moment, torpedoes traveling at 46 knots could close the distance and strike. By late May 1944, Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the U.S. Pacific Submarine Force, had studied Harder's patrol reports and had come to understand Japan's critical vulnerability. Ultra-code-breaking intelligence revealed that Japan had lost 23 destroyers between January and May 1944. They were running out of escorts for their convoys and screens for their fleet operations. Every destroyer sunk made Japan's entire naval strategy more fragile. Lockwood gave Dealey a mission that matched his aggressive temperament perfectly. Patrol the waters around Tawi Tawi, where Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had concentrated the Japanese mobile fleet. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, 28 destroyers. The largest concentration of Japanese naval power since Midway. And Dealey's job was to sink as many destroyers as he could find. Harder departed Fremantle, Australia, on May 26, 1944, and took up position near the heavily patrolled Sibutu Passage between Tawi Tawi and the northeastern tip of Borneo. For 9 days, Harder operated undetected, watching, waiting, studying the destroyer patrol patterns. Then, on the night of June 6th, everything accelerated. At 2100 hours, Harder spotted a convoy of 3 tankers escorted by 2 destroyers moving through the passage. Dealey ordered a surface approach, using Harder's superior speed to get into firing position ahead of the convoy. But the moon rose full and bright, silhouetting the submarine perfectly. The lead destroyer, Minazuki, spotted Harder immediately and turned to attack, her bow wave growing larger as she accelerated to flank speed. Dealey didn't have time to get into proper firing position. Minazuki was closing too fast. So he did something even more audacious than the down-the-throat shot. He turned Harder's stern toward the attacking destroyer and fired 3 torpedoes from the aft tubes. It was a desperation move. Stern tubes were harder to aim, and turning away made Harder look like she was running, which meant the destroyer captain would press his attack even harder. At 750 yards, 2 torpedoes struck Minazuki amidships. The destroyer broke in half. Her own depth charges detonated as she went down, killing all but 45 of her crew. The second destroyer immediately charged Harder's position. Dealey fired all 6 bow tubes in a spread pattern, but every torpedo missed. For the next 2 hours, Harder endured a depth charge attack that tested every weld and rivet in her hull. Day 2, June 7th, 1944. At 0300 hours, Harder surfaced to recharge batteries. The night was pitch black, no moon, heavy cloud cover. Perfect conditions for a submarine on the surface. But at 0312, radar picked up a contact. Single ship, bearing 095, range 8,000 yards, closing at 28 knots. Destroyer Hayanami, 1,700 tons, had been searching for American submarines since midnight. Her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, had orders to return to base at 0300, but decided to complete one more search sweep. Dealey ordered flank speed and turned directly toward the destroyer. He was going to attack on the surface at night, closing the range deliberately before Hayanami's radar could get a clear picture of what was hunting her. At 4,000 yards, Hayanami's radar operator finally picked up a surface contact, but he misidentified it as another Japanese destroyer returning to base. At 3,000 yards, Commander Kuboki realized his mistake. American submarine. He ordered flank speed and turned to ram. Too late. At 2,300 yards, Dealey fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck Hayanami's starboard side near the aft magazine. The explosion tore the destroyer's stern completely off. The ship rolled 90 degrees, her propellers still spinning uselessly as she went under stern first. Kuboki and 147 sailors died in less than a minute. Harder crash dived immediately. Japanese patrol planes would arrive within minutes, 2 destroyers in 24 hours. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, received the reports at his headquarters and felt something he hadn't experienced since Midway: genuine fear. He pulled 8 destroyers from convoy escort duty and organized them into hunter-killer groups with one mission: find and destroy the American submarine operating near Tawi Tawi. Day 3, June the 8th, 1944. Dealey took Harder south toward the Sibutu Passage, the narrow strait between Tawi Tawi and Borneo, where Japanese destroyers patrolled constantly. He wanted to see how many he could sink before the Japanese figured out his tactics. At 1400 hours, lookouts spotted 2 destroyers steaming in formation, Tanakazi and an unidentified escort, both moving at 25 knots in a standard search pattern. For 90 minutes, Dealey studied their movements. The destroyers followed a predictable zigzag, changing course every 8 minutes. That gave him maybe 30 seconds to set up a shot after each turn. He positioned Harder directly in their path and waited, the submarine hovering at periscope depth, her electric motors barely turning over, making almost no noise. At 16:30, Tanakazi turned toward Harder's position. Range, 3,000 yards. Dealey let her close. 2,500 yards, 2,000, 1,500. The destroyer's bow grew larger in the periscope lens, sharp and deadly, cutting through the water at 25 knots. At 1,200 yards, Dealey fired 4 torpedoes at 17-second intervals. The first torpedo missed. The second struck Tanakazi near the bridge. The third hit the forward magazine. The explosion was so massive that Harder's crew heard it clearly underwater, even with all hatches sealed. Tanakazi's bow section separated from the main hull. Both pieces sank within 3 minutes, taking 114 crew members, including the commanding officer, down with them. Only 126 survived. The escort destroyer immediately turned and charged Harder's position, dropping depth charges as she came. Dealey took Harder deep, 400 feet well below her designed test depth. The depth charges exploded overhead, each one sending a shock wave through the submarine that made her hull groan and her crew pray. After 40 minutes, the destroyer gave up and withdrew. 3 destroyers in 3 days. Admiral Ozawa, commander of the mobile fleet at Tawi Tawi, did the math. If an American submarine could penetrate his defensive screen this easily, the entire anchorage was vulnerable. He sent an urgent message to Admiral Toyota. The mobile fleet needed to depart Tawi Tawi immediately. Day 4, June 9th, 1944. At 0500, Dealey brought Harder to periscope depth, 12 miles southwest of Tawi Tawi. But what he saw made every man in the conning tower hold their breath. Dead ahead, 4 Japanese destroyers, steaming in line abreast formation, actively searching for submarines. Their sonar was pinging so loud, Harder's sound operator could hear it without headphones. Dealey had 8 torpedoes remaining. 4 destroyers meant he'd get maybe 2 shots before they overwhelmed him. He studied their formation through the periscope. The lead destroyer was zigzagging aggressively. The second was maintaining a steady course. That was his target. At 6:12, the second destroyer turned directly toward Harder's position. Range, 4,000 yards. Dealey waited, 3,000, 2,500. At 1,800 yards, he fired 3 torpedoes. All 3 struck the destroyer's port side within 5 seconds of each other. The ship exploded so violently that debris flew 300 feet into the air. She rolled over and sank in 90 seconds. The other 3 destroyers immediately converged on Harder's position. Dealey took her deep, 500 feet, deeper than he'd ever gone before. Depth charges began exploding overhead, 23 in the first 10 minutes. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. Hull plates groaned under the pressure. A pipe burst in the forward torpedo room, spraying seawater across the deck. For 2 hours, Harder's crew worked in silence, repairing damage while depth charges continued to detonate around them. Finally, at 0800 hours, the destroyers withdrew. They'd exhausted their depth charge supply. Dealey climbed to periscope depth. The destroyers were gone. 4 enemy warships sunk in 4 days. On June 10th at 0800, the Japanese mobile fleet departed Tawi-Tawi 6 days earlier than planned. Admiral Ozawa's original schedule called for departure on June 15th, which would have given his reconnaissance planes 4 days to locate the American fleet before battle began. His carriers would have been fully supplied, his destroyer screens properly organized, his battle plan coordinated with land-based aircraft from the Philippines. Instead, Harder forced him to leave early. American code breakers intercepted the movement orders within hours. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, adjusted his battle plans accordingly. The early departure gave American carriers an extra day to position themselves for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The battle began on June 19, 1944. 15 American carriers faced 9 Japanese carriers, 900 American aircraft against 430 Japanese aircraft. American pilots shot down 376 Japanese aircraft while losing only 30 of their own. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 3 Japanese carriers sank: Taiho, Shokaku, and Hio. 2 battleships damaged, 1 cruiser sunk. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 75% of its carrier air groups and would never recover. But the battle might have gone differently if Ozawa had arrived on schedule. His premature departure meant his fleet was scattered across 200 miles of ocean. His reconnaissance aircraft had burned through fuel reserves and couldn't conduct proper searches. His destroyers were still regrouping from anti-submarine patrols. When American carrier aircraft found Ozawa's fleet on June 19th, his carriers were still launching aircraft. His combat air patrol was undermanned. His fleet formation was disorganized. Admiral Charles Lockwood understood immediately. In his post-war memoir, he wrote that Harder's 5th Patrol was the most strategically important submarine operation of the Pacific War. 4 destroyers sunk meant 4 fewer escorts protecting Japanese carriers. But forcing the mobile fleet to depart early meant the entire Japanese battle plan collapsed before the first shot was fired. Dealey never knew any of this. On June 21st, Harder arrived at Darwin, Australia, where Admiral Ralph Christie presented Dealey with an Army Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony on the dock. General Douglas MacArthur sent a personal commendation. Harder's crew was given 2 weeks of shore leave while the submarine underwent repairs. Then, on August 5th, 1944, Harder departed Fremantle for her sixth and final war patrol. Harder's executive officer had tried to talk Dealey out of taking another patrol. Other officers noticed signs of exhaustion, the way Dealey's hands trembled slightly when he studied charts, the dark circles under his eyes that never seemed to fade. Admiral Christie met with Dealey privately and advised him to relinquish command. But with about a third of Harder's crew rotating out, Dealey believed he had a responsibility to ensure the new crew members were properly trained. Christie acquiesced. Harder departed as part of a 3-submarine wolf pack with USS Harder and USS Hake, with Dealey in tactical command. Their mission: patrol the waters west of Luzon and attack Japanese shipping heading to the Philippines. On August 21st, the Wolfpack intercepted a 16-ship convoy off Palawan Bay. In a coordinated attack, they sank 4 cargo ships totaling 22,000 tons. On August 22nd, Harder and Haddo attacked 3 coastal defense vessels, escort ships somewhat smaller than American destroyer escorts, but similarly armed. All 3 were damaged. On the morning of August 23rd, Harder and Haddo finished them off. Matsuwa, 134 killed, Hiburi, 154 killed, and Sado, 73 killed. By August 23rd, Haddo had expended all her torpedoes and withdrew. That left Harder and Hake operating together off Dassault Bay on the western coast of Luzon. Japanese intelligence had tracked the Wolfpack's movements and sent something to deal with them: escort ship CD-22 and patrol boat PB-102. At 0630 on August 24th, 1944, Harder and Hake were positioned outside Dassault Bay. Lieutenant Commander Frank Haler, captain of Hake, sighted 2 ships exiting the bay and misidentified them. The ships were CD-22 and PB-102. The latter was actually the former USS Stewart, an old Clemson-class destroyer that had been damaged, abandoned, raised by the Japanese, and put back into service. As the Japanese ships came out of Dassault Bay, they sighted a periscope and turned to attack. Hake commenced an approach, but the setup didn't look right, so Haler turned away. At that moment, he sighted Harder's periscope between Hake and CD-22. It was the last anyone saw of Harder. According to Japanese records, CD-22 made its attack run at 0728 hours. 2 torpedoes passed down CD-22's port side and 1 down her starboard side. Harder had fired a down-the-throat shot, but this time the torpedoes missed. CD-22 commenced a series of depth charge runs with her Type 94 depth charge throwers, each salvo set deeper than the last. The 5th salvo sank Harder, bringing massive quantities of oil, pieces of cork, and wood debris to the surface. All 79 men aboard died. Commander Samuel David Dealey, age 37, Lieutenant Samuel Logan, who'd earned a Navy Cross for rescuing a downed pilot at Wolei, Radio Man Calvin Bull, 24 years old, who'd been at Dealey's side through all 6 war patrols, 79 men from 38 states, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Michigan, college graduates from California. They'd volunteered for submarine duty, knowing that 22% of submariners who served in World War II would die, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. They knew the odds. They served anyway. On May 22nd, 2024, 80 years after she sank, an underwater exploration team led by Tim Taylor and the Lost 52 Project discovered Harder's wreck in the South China Sea. She sits upright on the seafloor at 3,750 feet, 12 miles west of Da Sol Bay. Her pressure hull remains mostly intact, except for depth charge damage, just aft of the conning tower, the mortal wound that CD-22 inflicted. The wreck is a protected war grave. No salvage operations are permitted. Commander Samuel David Dealey was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor on August 29, 1945, presented to his widow Edwina by President Harry Truman. He received 4 Navy Crosses during his lifetime, plus an Army Distinguished Service Cross and a posthumous Silver Star. Harder received the Presidential Unit Citation for her first 5 war patrols and 6 battle stars for World War II service. During the war, Dealey was credited with sinking 6 destroyers. Post-war analysis revised this to 4 confirmed destroyer kills, still the most warships sunk by a single submarine commander in U.S. Navy history, and quite likely the most of any submarine commander in any nation. Between June and December 1944, 12 American submarines adopted Dealey's aggressive tactics. The tactic's success rate was 63%. For every 5 attacks, submarines sank 3 destroyers and damaged 1 more. At the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, submarine tactics instructors still teach the down-the-throat attack as a case study in aggressive warfare. Not because modern submarines use the same tactic. Modern torpedoes are wire-guided and don't require close-range attacks. They teach it because Dealey's approach demonstrates a fundamental principle. When your enemy expects you to run, charging often works better than hiding. Dealey's grave is at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 59, grave 874. His headstone lists his rank, his dates of service, and 1 line, Medal of Honor, Destroyer Killer. Families of Harder's crew visit every year on August 24th, the anniversary of her sinking. They place flowers. They share stories about grandfathers and great uncles who died at 22 or 25 or 37, fighting a war most of them never expected to survive. The last survivor of Harder's crew, Paul Bryce, died in 2022 at age 98. With his death, no one who served aboard Harder remains alive to tell their story firsthand. That's why these stories matter. These men left behind patrol reports and radio messages and Medal of Honor citations. But those documents can't convey what it felt like to charge a destroyer at flank speed, or hear depth charges exploding overhead, or watch your captain make decisions that meant life or death for everyone aboard. The official history tells us Harder sank 4 destroyers in 4 days during her 5th patrol, plus 2 escort vessels during her 6th. Between all 6 patrols, Harder sank 18 ships, totaling 54,002 tons, not counting the warships. But numbers can't capture what Dealey and his crew accomplished. They proved that submarines could hunt the hunters. They forced an entire Japanese fleet to abandon a critical anchorage 6 days early, disrupting the timing for what would become the most decisive carrier battle of the Pacific War. They changed submarine warfare doctrine across the entire U.S. Navy. Harder's motto was, "Hit 'em harder." For 6 war patrols spanning 15 months, 79 men lived that motto every single day. They paid the ultimate price doing something the Navy said was impossible, sinking destroyers in direct combat while both vessels actively engaged. Commander Samuel David Dealey and the crew of USS Harder didn't just fight the war, they changed how it was fought, and in the end, that made all the difference.